Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to this Techstrong learning experience brought to you by AWS and Datadog. My name is Cody, and I'm the host of Techstrong Learning, and we are back with another exciting event. Today, we have just a couple of housekeeping notes we'd like to cover before we do kick things off. Today's session is being recorded, so if you'd like to rewatch or perhaps share this with a friend, you will be receiving an email with a link to access the recording on demand after the event concludes. If you'd like to engage with us, there are a couple of ways for you to do so, and the first of which is going to be the chat tab found on the right side of your screen. I'd like you to go ahead and start testing that function out for us right now by letting us know from where you are joining us. Of course, if you have any questions, we do request that you send those into the Q&A tab directly to the right of the chat tab. This just helps us keep track of these, and we'd really like to answer as many questions as we can today. So be sure to send them in early and often.
Nigeria. Cool.
Very cool. We do have an additional handout over in that handout section for you if you'd like to click on that. And before we close out, we will be giving away not only 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, but we're also giving away a t-shirt. So our topic today is how to integrate successful DevSecOps practices within your enterprise. And I'm joined by Sam Elmalak, Solutions Leader of Cloud Foundations at AWS, and Nathan Case, Senior Technical Advocate at Datadog. So Sam, Nathan, thank you both for joining me today. Nathan, you want to go ahead and get this ball rolling?
Yeah, thank you so much, Cody. This is great. So, hey, I'm Nate. Today we're going to talk about DevOps, but DevSecOps. And that's kind of an interesting way to start. But let's be honest, DevOps really is DevSecOps if you're doing it right. So as we talk about this, it really is kind of the concept of how do we integrate DevSecOps or DevOps into your enterprise appropriately? And what are the things that we need to do to get there? Now, Sam and I are going to speak about this. So a little bit of background on Sam and I. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, both Sam and I worked at a place called AWS. And while we were there, we started working on some multi-account strategy documents. And Sam will tell us a little bit about that in a minute. But part of that then turned into some of the things that we're going to talk about today. So there's a lot of history here. There's a lot of fun stuff that we're going to talk about. And that kind of brings us to who we are. Well, I'm Nate. I am jokingly the janitor of the internet. My friends consider me a dumpster fire guru. What that means is generally, I am the individual that people call at 2 a.m. when things go horribly, horribly wrong. And then I come and help you. A lot of folks like to think that that's a lot of fun and exciting and interesting, but normally it just really screws up my sleeping patterns. As we talk about things like this today, really it's kind of a selfish way for me to hopefully fix things so I don't have to get up at 2 a.m. for someone at some point in the future. And ideally for the rest of your security engineers not to have to do that either. So I'm going to hand this off to Sam. Sam?
Yep. And I'm Sam Elmalak. I am Solutions Leader for the Cloud Foundations Initiative within AWS. And as Nate mentioned, I was part of the team that helped launch the multi-account strategy, helped launch database landing zone solution in AWS, and now currently Cloud Foundations. Some people like to tease me and say I'm father of multi-account strategy, but the reality is it was just something that we all needed. And we started to figure out how to do it. And at an offsite for that, we realized that we need to think broader. What is the foundation? What are the things that customers need? And just because Nate decided to be the janitor of the internet, I decided I'll pick a general contractor title. I don't get called at 2 o'clock in the morning, but I'll make sure other people get called at 2 o'clock in the morning.
So if you're the father of multi-account strategy, then does that make me the uncle or something?
You can be whoever you want to be.
Cool. So we're going to talk a lot about DevOps today, and we're going to talk about things that go into and work inside of clouds and your data centers and all the other things that you have going on right now. But the basis for all of this is communication. And I'm starting here because realistically, when we get down to what is DevOps, and frankly, what is DevSecOps, the key point that I want to make sure that everybody takes away, the TLDR here, is communication. If you take nothing else away from this webinar, and you decide that you don't want to follow any of the things that we tell you to do, keep in mind that communication from the security org, typically, let's be honest, can be a little bit gruff, is really the most important thing that we can do. So communication is key, and I want to point that out right now. Now, when we talk about communication and we talk about DevOps, let's talk about what DevOps is. So from my point of view, as a developer, operationalist, and security geek, I look at this and say DevOps is these things. Now, I found this really cool blog that we've included down here that really went through and just said this is what DevOps is. And I really liked it. It really kind of comes down to a point of talking about how this is a collaboration. It's a unification of different skills, different disciplines, and deals with all of the things that we need to deal with in today's world. Now, there's a lot of things that we can talk about as far as security. There's a lot of crazy things going on in the world right now as far as vulnerabilities and 0 days and all these other things. But the reality is, if we pull everything back and we start way back at the beginning and we look at how would we begin to implement, how would we begin to look at DevSecOps? I want to start with what is DevOps. It's a culture. It's a set of things that we're going to do. It's a way of working together. And specifically, it is a movement of practitioners for practitioners by practitioners. Why is that important? Because that's a statement of who we are, making sure that we continue to be who we are and not being driven by another portion of the business. And that's really important when it comes to creating good code, creating good applications, architectures, and in the end, security. What it is not. DevOps is not a set of tools. I get it. Like, I work for Datadog. I am very proud to be working for Datadog. I will talk to you about tools at the end of this. And tools are kind of tools are important. We have to have tools to do some of this, mostly because what we have in our imagination doesn't just necessarily jump to the internet just yet. But right now, tools, when we talk about just what DevOps is, it's not the point. DevOps isn't a set of standards. It's not a set of criteria that I can hand you and say, go do these things. There's no product that I can give you that is DevOps, and then all of a sudden your entire organization enterprise will be DevOps. It's not a job title, as much fun as that has been. I've actually had the title of AVP of DevOps at one point, and shaking my head, I finally accepted it, even though HR insisted that it was real. I knew that it wasn't. And so as we look at these things, we have to make sure that we understand where we're going and where we want to stay away from. So instead of looking at this like a security geek and being really gruff and saying, thou shalt not do these things, think about it more like these are the guardrails. You're doing good DevOps, good DevSecOps, when you're not leaning on too hard any of these things, when you don't care about what your job title is, when you actually are trying to do the good thing for the enterprise and for the stuff that you're trying to deploy, and frankly, for your fellow developers and operationalists and security people. Does that seem about right, Sam?
Yeah, it's oftentimes it's just having the title, or even within Cloud Foundations, when we think about it, we don't look at, let me help you set up DevOps. I'm going to help you set the capabilities and things in place that as you advance through them, you get to the point where you're ready to take it on.
And I think that's where we're hoping to be today. Now, I am going to include a slide here about what DevSecOps is. So as we go into this and we talk about it and we look at security and observability everywhere, okay, that seems pretty straightforward, right? We're going to embed in development and testing phases. Cool. So security is here and there and all of the other places. We're going to look at pre and post deployment monitoring. The security is there too. Why? Well, again, why wouldn't security be there? We're going to talk a little bit about back to the basics later with Sam. And we're going to go into making sure that stories are functional stories too. As we look at these things and we talk about what does that mean? Well, okay, if security and observability are everywhere, that means that everyone can communicate, back to that fun word, everybody can observe, everybody can see, and we all speak from one singular truth. We make sure that all of the things that we've got are embedded in all of the stages. What does that mean? Well, I want to be able to see, as an operationalist, what development is currently working on so that I can evaluate the monitoring that they're currently working on so that I can make sure that when they deploy it, the operations that I've got to do are going to have the monitoring that I need so that I can make sure that the website's up or whatever you're running. Now, we need to make sure that security is embedded in these places as well, because, well, let's be honest, if you're the developer and you find out right before the end of a development cycle that you're not meeting a criteria, some governance rule that you need to meet, it sucks. Nobody likes to get to the end of this and realize that they have to go back and do more work. So the goal for DevSecOps is really to make sure that everything flows as easily as possible. that we look at the things that are involved in the pieces that we need to do. And that generally means governance. That means that we have guidance as developers somehow that we can do that. And Sam and I are going to talk to you about how that works. And all of this comes down to communication. As Sam and I worked through the original account, multi-account strategies and whatnot, I think communication was one of the things that a bunch of extremely, shall we call it, large ego individuals had to work on.
Highly opinionated individuals.
Highly opinionated individuals had to work on most. And we built a common framework. That's really what we're looking at here. But how long did it take us to get all parties to agree to what we were working on?
Several months at least.
Yeah.
And even then it was in full agreement.
We agreed to disagree. But the beautiful part here is that what this came down to was, in all of the work that we did to get a lot of the foundations that we're going to talk about today, we had to do these processes. These processes by nature are the things that we're asking you to do. We've been through this. We've had to do this. I've done this both at a private company that I owned and then for companies and enterprises throughout the world. This is an important thing to get to do. Communication is the key to do all of this. Now, as we sit here, what does that mean? Well, when we think about it, communication is based off of context. If Sam and I are both looking at the same image, the same thing, it really becomes easier. If I say the sky is blue and Sam looks up and it's red, we've got a problem. We need to understand the context for each other so that communication becomes simple between the two of us. We also need to make sure that everybody can see the sky. So if I say, hey, Sam, what color is the sky? And he's sitting in a mine in, somewhere else, then he's going to look up and see nothing but rocks. We need to make sure that everybody sees the same thing. And when we say everybody's included, we're not just talking about DevSecOps. We're talking about HR. We're talking about finance. We're going to get into a little bit of FinOps here, right? I'm not sure who's heard of FinOps, but that's actually a really cool thing that is important. We need to look at how the financial impact of the choices we make as DevSecOps engineers, DevOps engineers, operationalists, you have your pick, affect the entire business. And so as we look at this, what does this give us? Well, goals and requirements for communication end up breeding observability because we want to observe the things that we're talking about, the things that we're writing down. And that leads us to build more goals and requirements, which leads us to more statuses, more metrics, more understanding as we go around. And funnily enough, we create a flywheel. Sorry. All of the things that come into the silliness from discussing this stuff, it really does become a flywheel. You end up building more observability, more communication every time you make a step, every time you take an effort to continue down this path. And that's important. Now, as we get into this, it struck me that about 5 years ago in 2020, 2019, I guess 4 years ago, I wrote a blog that was based on a talk that Stephen Schmidt gave. The initial talk was on 10 items that we should spend as enterprises our time. Now, originally, this was titled security groups or security teams. When we wrote this, the intent was that security people should do this. But realistically, that was really obtuse of us, and we should have actually been saying the enterprise as a whole, especially as we look at the realities around us today. If communication is key, we should explain why these 10 things are important. And we should be able to look at these 10 things. So as we talk about all of the things that are over the internet, as we talk about all of the white papers, all of the DevOps options, all of the things that occur, I'm going to ask you to think back to some basic concepts that you've read in these papers. And many of these papers actually take a significant portion of these 10 things and rewrite them in different words. We want to make sure that security is involved in DevCycle. That's definitely something that DevSecOps should entail. But realistically, security should be involved in everything we do anyway. So as I wrote this blog, it became more and more clear to me that security itself was architecture. And as we look at what we're talking about today, which is DevOps and communication and the things that we need to do, all of these different articles, all of these different white papers started to boil down or distill into a single set of things that we ought to be looking at. So if we think about things from this point of view, realistically, cloud is just an abstraction. It's really just something that sits out there. So as we talk about things today, there's no real specific vendor that counts. It could technically be on my laptop back here that I happen to have VMware Workstation on. And I should be doing it the same way as I'm doing it out here. Now, there definitely are more cool tools and APIs that we can get into as we get into AWS, as we get into the different larger cloud providers. The basics will always be the same here. So as we start taking these things apart, we'll start talking about how some of that works. And when we think about it, I'm going to push you and say that realistically, security is development. Sorry. This is kind of one of those things where we start taking it apart and look at it and go, wait, well, who's going to develop that? Well, the security person? Maybe, but if they do, what are they really? Well, they're a security developer. Interesting. So think about these 10 things. We'll talk about them as we go a little bit here and there. I might mention them again. I don't think we have another slide with them, but still, it will come up. And I think that's where we go. Now, as a side note, and something that I found interesting, not particularly necessarily on trail with what we just talked about, but think about this more like a takeaway. My wife is a counselor, and she likes to use the rule of 3 before me. And I found, as a security geek who tends to be relatively brazen, as Sam was nice enough to say, as we look at things like this and we look at meetings and we look at things that security people do, realistically, we do a really bad job of communicating many times because we feel like it's important. We feel like we need to say something. So there are a couple of things we can talk about. One of them is 3 before me, which is a way to communicate and wait for 3 people to speak before you speak again. We can educate the people we work with, generally called a security champions program. Datadog is going to be opening up an open source security champions program this year. And hopefully we'll be able to stick that in the next webinar we do. And we need to make sure that we prep with the needed time. So when we're getting ready to do something, we need to make sure we spend the time to communicate the things that go in. So apologies for the quick detour, but here we are. As we get to examples, Sam, what examples do you think we could do with this?
I mean, one of the things that you've been saying, Nathan, is about the idea of security being part of everything, security being developing things, and all of this being everybody's responsibility. I can name at an employer at some point, I used to be a software development engineer, and I found ways to stand up jump boxes and other things through development machines so I can bypass whatever annoying security things were put in place. And I thought I was just making my life easier. So I will echo what you said about the fact if had it been a conversation early on, been involved from the very beginning, thinking through what does it take to get this so it's usable, along with things being secure, I probably would have been much less likely to create those little hacks to get what I want done. So I didn't have to sit there and go through a whole bunch of steps that to me as a developer didn't make any sense. I may have done this more than once and I've never been caught doing it, but it's stuff that I've done. I do not currently do this, just so everybody knows, but I've done that in the past. So speaking of those things, when we think about different areas that we have within our foundation, within our security paradigm, things like cloud financial management, as we work through cloud foundations, more and more I've discovered that so many things depend on a lot more stakeholders than I initially thought. When I used to do well-architected reviews, back when the well-architected program was getting big and we were going after more and more customers, we used to kind of half joke with customers, even internally, that we would call it cloud therapy, because it was the first time we would get a number of stakeholders together across multiple teams and organizations in the same room to talk about the topic. So when we think about cloud financial management, finance, central IT, and software engineering are involved because finance may want to look at it. They may be responsible for buying reserved instances, for example, so they can get cost benefits. But software engineering is making the decisions on what instances to use, and not having that right input or that buy-in from them can potentially cost significantly more. When I think about identity management and access control, security, of course, is involved. Sometimes there might be an identity team that owns it. Software engineering, because they've got inputs and ways to go in and potentially figure out how to use these identities, whether it's programmatically or, like I was doing, setting up jump boxes some places to get the IP addresses to happen so I didn't have to deal with some of it. Central IT, because they're owning processes around potentially operations and other things. And of course, HR from a joiners and leavers process. What happens when somebody comes and joins? So as we started to think about these things, we started to look through what are the basics? What are the things that I need to do to achieve this? And it turns out that just like Nate was saying, a lot of it comes down to the basics. If I'm going to establish a foundational thing here for my DevSecOps, I need to be able to deploy, operate, and govern. And we were very intentional about choosing those three, because if I go focus on deploying, I miss the operational side of it, I miss the governance side of it. If I focus on operations, then in some cases I might get to a point where I build an amazingly operated thing, but maybe I don't allow my developers to use Lambda or some other serverless technologies, because now I limit their innovation by what my pipelines can do. And same thing applies to security. I might limit the innovation, the ability to launch new products, because I've chosen to do things manually in certain aspects, as opposed to involving everybody in the picture and understanding and gathering requirements. And both Nate and I fully recognize this is hard. This is not an easy thing to do. And there is times I wish I could just make my own decisions and just go. So when we start to think about it, what are these foundations? What is the architecture? What is the planning that I do behind it? There's a number of capabilities that customers need to think about. Everything from log storage to identity management, forensics, cloud financial management. All of these are things that are needed. And when we start out, we might have the manual, but as we get to move toward that DevSecOps, more of that automation side of the world, how do I put enough things in place? How do I develop enough guardrails around it? Or as Nate pointed out, how do I have the right security practitioners, the right development in the security side to be able to keep up with those things happening? So as I think about it, how do I deploy, operate, and govern? What are the processes, the people, and technology that I need to have in place? How do I make sure that goes in place and have a guided path around it so I grow into it? One thing that we've come to recognize is customers need to be met where they are. Or I start where I am as a customer and keep moving forward. And I almost earn my way into DevOps or DevSecOps because I go figure out a whole bunch of hard lessons learned to get to that point. So how do I start and keep growing into that and make things happen? So put that together in terms of a set of capabilities. As I think of what I need to do as a customer or as a practitioner in this, how do I have the right things in place to build the right capabilities and grow in those capabilities to make that happen? Oftentimes customers might come in and say, I want to do massive innovation. I want to do a whole bunch of things, transform in all of that. And we start going down that path, but the reality is it does take work to make that happen. There's a number of steps that people have to be ramped up, processes have to be built out, technology and tools have to be available to be able to pull this. But if I start with the tools alone, like Nate said, I don't get to catch up on the people and process because they may not know how to use those things in the right way. They may not feel confident enough. Oftentimes we run into customers that say, there's no way I will allow developers to write a piece of code and have it automatically build, get deployed, and go to production. And when we dive deeper into it, well, why? Well, it's because I don't trust them. Okay, well, if there's enough tests and things in place to make that happen, well, no, I still don't trust them. I want a manual approval button. Well, what will that do? At least I'll look at it, but will you look through everything? Maybe, maybe not. But it ends up being that transition of, well, you know what? This stuff actually works. And the earlier as security practitioners we get into that process, whether it's code or things in place that validates firewall policies or identity management or identity policies that are there. And we'll dive into that as we go. Nate, any thoughts so far?
I think that's a good point. We talked at one of the things that was an Amazon leadership principle for a while was the concept of building trust. And I think that was one of the most interesting leadership principles to me was, you know what, if we do things the right way and we do it repeatedly, we build trust over time. And so when we talk about the scared security person, I've been the scared security person before. One of the things that really does help is repeatedly doing something so that it lets us all see that we know how to do it. And it sounds silly and it gets horribly annoying as a developer and it gets horribly annoying as a security person as well. But the reality is that we need to build trust with each other over time. And part of that goes back to the communication concept.
Yeah. And speaking of that perfect transition that Nate just did without realizing it, identifying the right stakeholders and and making sure that we've got the right people involved. So when we think about capabilities and things for a foundation or those back to the basics, security, finance, central IT, networking, operations, software engineering. I don't think I've met a single customer where they looked at this and said, this is everybody, we're good to go, let's move forward. Sometimes they'll add a business person, add product leads, or they'll add other pieces around it that might come in. Same thing for your particular company. Who are the right stakeholders to do this? As we think through every one of the capabilities, who are the right people that need to be there to make the decisions? Back to that well-architected example with the cloud therapy and the idea that we're there to talk through it. We even tell our own account solutions architects, identify the right people as you're working with the customer. Because based on that, I can get the right decisions made. And the sooner I can have those people in place, the sooner I can move forward. So go ahead, Nathan.
I was going to say, I think it's interesting to watch when it switches too. So like as a security geek, all of a sudden we're deploying to take your pick in Europe. Suddenly it's GDPR or something along those lines that we, it's in England. So GDPR, and we have to worry about this thing now. Well, what does that change for your organization? Is that a different group of legal? Is that HR? Who is that? Who needs to have that conversation?
And oftentimes even just for identity, we found many organizations have their own identity teams that are separate from security. And now they become another stakeholders because maybe we try and figure out automations and things with the security organization, but the identity team hasn't been able to keep up. So when we think about these capabilities and the overall framework, we can start looking at these bigger things. So we'll dive deeper into some of these things. So if I look at log storage, how do we make sure we've got central reliable log storage? Make sure that those logs are protected. There's the right integrity. Make sure there's the right access management around them. And not just for operational purposes, for security reasons, for troubleshooting. And oftentimes we find organizations that there's different logs stored in several different places that have different purposes without a correlation across them.
I think it becomes interesting too as we look to deploy and we look at how we're going to put this thing into place. The easy answer generally is, I'm just going to dump it into S3. There are plenty of different ways to do appropriate log storage. And part of this is looking at what those ways are for your business. Part of that is understanding whether or not you have multiple cloud providers, whether you have lots and lots of data centers. What is the actual transit cost of those logs, both in time and in money? Don't forget that transiting logs is bandwidth intensive in some cases and can take too much time to actually make the logs worthwhile, unless we're talking about long-term forensics. And as we look at this, part of that then becomes, well, if we're going to put them in a bunch of different places, then my protection and integrity issue goes way off the charts. It's just really hard because now I've got to protect everything all over the place. Okay, well then let's balance that back to a central location. In some cases, it's the concept of using something like a Datadog in the middle. Why? Well, we can aggregate all of those things into one place. It makes it easier. We don't have to have a whole lot of people worried about log protection and integrity. Log access management all becomes kind of a question of what did you select in the interface as far as the rights go. And I think as we look at this, as we look at how this ties back to DevOps and back to the concept of DevSecOps, if everybody doesn't have the logs they need, then we haven't done DevOps correctly at this point. So that means that if there's a business case for the HR department looking at logs to evaluate whether or not someone has done something inappropriately for an internal threat analysis, if that happens to be where internal threat sits in your org, then we have to make sure that they have the ability to get to those logs, but only the logs that they need to get to. One of the interesting questions here becomes, and I'll pass this back to Sam on this note, is the data tagging that goes into this type of thing. And how do you evaluate the tags that go onto the logs that you're actually giving to people? i.e., should Sam have these logs or should Nathan have these logs, and why so?
And back to the whole idea of observability or communication around some of this stuff, thinking through like when a developer has an issue, oftentimes they require access to underlying systems to go troubleshoot it because they go in there, access their logs and try and find out an issue there. So they get access to production systems for the purpose of troubleshooting a thing. Whereas really what they might have needed was a way to access those logs in the right way, securely, and being able to correlate events that happen within their workload all the way down to a particular network traffic communication or a particular user entry that may have happened in an application. So having the logs in that central place, being able to access it from a security perspective, from an operational, from a development perspective, can influence how much access I can give to my development teams to production systems. I've worked with a number of enterprises where they decide, I want to prevent all developers from accessing production systems. They decide, yep, we'll do that as part of our migration to the cloud. They go down the path, build things in place, lock out access till something goes wrong, and they realize we never built the right mechanisms to search through those logs so that they don't need access to those systems. And what ends up happening is they do give them back access and they go do this stuff because they have to continue to operate the business.
Let's be honest, they don't just give them back access. They go, shoot, admin, and then off you go. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's really where we get into some of the tagging.
Perfect. And then from a tagging perspective, I've worked with customers who years later, being in the cloud, have resources that are still running, they're paying for it, and don't know who owns it. Can't shut it down because they don't know what it might impact, don't know why it's running, but it's still there and it's available. So a big part that we tell our customers when you start out is, again, what are the right tags? What are the right things to put in place? And not just tags around who the owner is in cost center. There might be security related tags. This workload should never have access to the internet. Or this workload might have credit card information or health information or different things around the tagging. You might decide to make up some codes for it or things so it's not as obvious, but just making sure that these things are available and built in from day one with tag compliance. You'll see there's a QR code here. We released a piece of guidance that talks about example tags and things customers could be using from day one. This way they don't end up stuck in that position years later or months later, where they don't know what the security profile of something is, why it's running the way it is, or what controls should even be around it.
One of the things that this helps as far as like, from my point of view, when we look at I'm going to go do a threat hunt, or I'm going to try to operationalize the logs that you've now handed me, or the things that you've now handed me, is the fact that tagging gives us a really good way in a data structure, regardless of the data structure, to begin to pivot on those particular logs. I need to see everything that's, I don't know, come up with your application name and we'll do that. Okay, cool. Well, if I don't have those tags and I've got 2 terabytes of logs, coming up with the actual log files that are appropriate to the particular application in question takes a lot longer. And that's where I spent quite a bit of time with Athena, playing with all sorts of different things, querying customer logs as I worked at AWS, doing incident response for some of the stuff that Sam and I were working on, taking things apart and trying to understand where the customers had actually stowed their log files. In an incident, in the middle of a thing, you don't want to have to try to figure this out. This is something that has to go, doesn't have to, should definitely go before all of the time of an incident. This is one of the investments you make in your business to allow you to do it the right way. Now, that said, it also allows you to then limit the amount of visibility into something. If Sam's our developer today and Sam doesn't really need to see PII, but he wants to see production logs, then I need to make sure that I tag those logs appropriately and we actually have a reasonable data classification policy for the things in those logs. And this is one of the things that, okay, yeah, I get it. Is this really operational, and can I take it back and do this today in my business or in my cloud account? And the answer is, sort of. Yeah, you can start. And yes, it will take you a really long time. But if you don't start today, you're never going to start. So let's just get it going.
Yeah. And then as we think through that access, or what are we establishing in terms of policies and things within the environment, do we have the right policies that we've put together as security practitioner, developers, or anybody that indicate what is the best practice here? What is the appropriate policy to have on a role that I'm going to use to access, for example, an S3 bucket? What is the right policy I'm going to use for an application that'll be internet facing with direct customer interaction? What is my programmatic access? Even just machine images. What are my images, or container images, or serverless, any of those things? We write policies, we put things in place. How do we put that and make it available?
Sorry, replying to one of the comments. I agree. I think as we look at this, it becomes kind of the question of, what is a policy? What does a template look like? And I think historically, you and I have built templates. I don't even remember, Remember the guy named Brett that used to build those blueprints? But we build templates all over the place, and we do wonderful jobs of templating a thing that somebody could go use, but we didn't really give consideration to how it was going to be used as a third-party vendor. And as you get into your organization and you're doing the templates for your people and you're looking at how these things are going to happen, this is definitely something that should exist in the architecture, thought process, governance, policy, compliance sections of your company. If you look to do something, there really ought to be a template on how you're going to do it. And I get it, the first time you're going to do it, you're going to POC it and you're going to try to figure it out. And all of that's fine. But we all know what happens to a POC. It goes to production. Yep. So understanding what you're doing here and making sure that as you look at the templates you're making, you're actually giving people the templates that they need. And that goes double for the security geeks in the audience. Yep. So if you're a security geek and you're telling somebody, Sam, you have to use, well, why are you telling him? Shouldn't you be putting that in a template so he can simply pull the template and then make sure he's using the right thing? And you should also have a synthetic check and an actual monitoring check to evaluate that he is using the certain thing, even in development, so that when he goes ahead and builds his code and posts it to his test branch or posts it to development even, shouldn't there be some level of ability for him to actually see in the monitoring pane that should be in his development window that this doesn't work already? We've already broken governance policy, Maybe it's encryption at rest. And suddenly we're not actually doing encryption at rest and we're just dumping it into a bucket, an object store somewhere. Well, That's a problem. We probably ought to take care of that now as opposed to production. And I certainly don't want to call for it at 2 a.m, finding out that somebody left an S3 bucket open. So understanding how that works is really important. And I think we help ourselves as security people to make sure that doesn't happen.
And that leads us to the developer experience. What is it, Jurassic Park? Nature will find a way or something. Developers will find a way. Or at least I will speak on behalf of myself. I always found a way to get what I needed done. And in some cases, yes, it involved maybe setting something that was slightly against policy or put a jump box where I shouldn't or find ways to...
Passwords and get.
That I've never done.
Okay.
But yes, like I can find ways to do the work. Like a big part of a skill set of a developer or a software engineer is you figure out how to solve the problem. And if the problem is I can't access my test server because you've put a whole bunch of IP addresses blocking it, okay, I'll just open that up. But having things set up in such a way that developers are able to pull in things and pull in security easily, or relatively easily, is one of the ways to ensure that it actually continues to happen. So back to that template management that we talked about. If all I have to do is add a line that says, pull in the security group policy because I'm doing a non-internet facing thing, and it's part of my build file, then that's it. All I've had to do that. And if the security organization continues to update those things, my next build will pull that from its own repo. Integration directly with the build pipeline. So there might be additional configuration files or things that get placed, such as this allowed IP addresses from any application security group, so that if something goes to build it, an error message pops to the developer right away during the build process, says, nope, you cannot open these IP addresses. And they can immediately fix it as part of that build process, as opposed to something going down the line and they're about to go to production. You have a review and people accept the risk and say, yep, go for it. We've got a launch. And now you're competing with the business priorities. So having it pre-existing built in a way that fits into the development process and making that keep happen, providing those services to developers.
Pipelines are really good things. We should use them.
Words of wisdom.
There are days when it's simple.
Yeah. Yes. And then from there, all of that comes together to start making sure we've got the right application security. How are they doing auth and access controls? I have seen developers, and we all hear about backdoors and all of that fun stuff. And like, I've been guilty of putting in an if statement in some workloads when I'm developing them to just bypass everything to see if I can go test it and make sure it works. I have never had that go to production, but but there's all kinds of, like, imagine if there's a mechanism to do that from the very beginning. That's part of the templates, part of the things that allows that to happen, with maybe proper IP address verification or things. Making sure that encryption is built in. Oftentimes, it's skipped because maybe it's not as easy. With the cloud, it becomes as simple as a checkbox, but having that configuration part of the pre-configured templates, when I go create a new thing, it's already built in. I don't have to do anything extra.
And it should be monitored so that if it does get screwed up, everybody gets a flag and we know that it's happened.
Yeah. So having all of those pieces, again, back to the basics, to get to the DevSecOps thing is how do we make sure we've got the right building blocks and things all the way from the very beginning of how do I store my logs or how do I have the right templates in place? Because that enables me to get down the line where I can really go do those advanced things and keep moving forward with it.
And that brings us to examples. We get to talk about the fun things in reality. So this is where we get to the tools portion of the discussion. We're going to talk a little bit about how to actually do some of this stuff and what it looks like. So the way this works, if we think about it, if we think about observability, and I'm going to point out that in my opinion, observability is the foundation of security. We can't have security without observability. Now, I suppose that's not necessarily true. We could just unplug it all, but that kind of doesn't make it very useful. So assuming that we've got it plugged in, we have to have observability. You wanted to say something? I'm sorry.
No, I did not. I just moved.
So as we look at infrastructure monitoring, that turns into cloud security management. When we think about the things that are going on inside of a data center and observability and moving it into security. So you'll note that some of these names change, and that's okay. I think that comes with the semantics of understanding who we are, developers and admins, or developers and security geeks, and going back to how do we relate to each other? We talk about application performance monitoring. Well, realistically, it's the same stuff. It's the same data that we look at for security management, even vulnerability evaluations. And that said, why wouldn't we just hand that information back to devs and say, look, it's cool that you're doing this, but by the way, you have log4j and it's 2 years later. Please take care of that. You should use a different version, or better yet, hey, here's the actual library that you should use so that when you do include it in your code, it's automatically included at the right level. And I think that turns into what we can, as security people, give to developers is how do we figure out those templates? Log management and turning that into a cloud SIM, being able to see something at a third-party location and understand that all of the things that are there in the SIM actually are appropriate to the things that are happening both in development, testing, and prod. Now, what does that look like? So in my opinion, we start by writing down the rules. Now, as you'll note, Sam also had the same opinion earlier, so we'll take that as a corollary expert, and this is obviously the right answer. Writing down all your stuff is important, and it's important for a number of reasons. It's not just important because we need to make sure that they're readable. Yes, your governance policies should be readable, but we also need to make sure that we can evaluate those policies as developers. Now, what I'm stating there is I've worked for large companies, Fortune 10 companies before, that had governance policies that read like it was a legal manual. And I'm sorry, if you need to be a lawyer to read your governance policies, it's broken. How do I take those governance policies and turn them into Python? Should really be the question that you ask yourself when you write them down. When we talk about architecture standards, I know you had some really strong opinions about this when we did multi-account theory, Sam, about mutable architecture thoughts.
Yeah, like one of the things that we would struggle with is customers make a decision and just stay with it. Forever. Despite of everything else around them changing, or despite of new services, for example, getting released or things that are happening. So I might have a framework in mind. And one thing Nate used to always be a fan of and made sure that we did as part of multi-account strategy was, can we make sure that the reasons for what we did are documented? And we know why we did what we did, so that as customers or partners or anybody looks at it, makes decisions based on the reason. So you look at the guidance and say, okay, well, you've got this. Can I change it to here? Well, here's why we did it. Yeah, it's consistent with what we're doing. So we've got plenty of customers that may look at the multi-account strategy guidance and vary from it. But so long as the intention and the things behind it is there. So being able to have those architectural standards and putting it in place, but also being able to know that they will change. I've worked with customers where development teams could not use Lambda or serverless technology or something that actually will solve the problem very easily, because in this case, the operations team did not have build pipelines that would allow them to make use of that because they couldn't build it.
Yep.
So this is a perfect example where developers go find a way to make it happen, or they spend a significantly more time trying to make it happen. So being able to change those things and make them meet whatever the latest standards are as we move forward.
You just spun up an EC2 instance and ran it all through Python, didn't you?
I have not personally done it, but they found a way.
And we have to make sure that the controls are applied. So once we start looking at how we're going to look at the compliance of the governance policies that we've written, we have to build controls to do that. And the way we do that is something like this. Now, this is a Datadog webinar. Obviously, I'm going to talk about Datadog. This is the thing that it is. But cloud security management gives you the ability to evaluate the posture of your cloud right now. And that's great. That helps you understand what that posture management looks like. It helps you understand where you're sitting and what the things are as far as whether or not you're actually currently in compliance with the things that you evaluate as needed. These are the regulations that we want to comply with. Now, some of the people in the audience don't have the ability to say, I don't want to comply. Some of you are actually highly regulated and the government forces you to do things. This is a way for you to figure that out. As we look at the other things that go through this, as a developer, we want to build with observability as a foundation. So as we think about this, we need to start understanding that the governance policies that we just wrote a second ago are going to end up in our code. And we need to make sure that when code is connected, it's connected to ticketing as well. We need to make sure that we get tickets on the things that we write that don't work. If we write something and it's against policy, there should be a ticket for it pretty damn quick. As we get into code being reviewed by tooling, we should have something evaluating whether or not the things that we're writing, that is infrastructure as code, that is the app that we're writing, that is all of the pieces parts, whether those things are actually compliant with the standards that we want them to be. Now, vulnerabilities are a really fun one. Everybody loves vulnerabilities lately. Software security supply chain, software supply chain security, there we go, is all put together on this concept of being able to find the vulnerabilities and get rid of them. Well, we have to do that at each stage of the software development lifecycle. If we don't, then we're going to find ourselves at development's door with a bunch of production vulnerabilities potentially that we need to take care of. Now, the issue that I've seen here is that we have a development team that gets halfway done or 90% done with their code, and someone comes back to them and hands them a thing and says, hey, by the way, did you know you're using the old version of Log4j? Or did you know you're using the other version of this other library? Not looking to point at any specific development language here, but just one of those things where it happens over and over and over again, where they find out there was a vulnerability in the code that's been in there for 2 or 3 months and they could have fixed it long, long, long ago, but now it's a big problem. And we need to make sure that we move all of these things towards the developer as far as we can. If the developer can get to the pipeline and evaluate the pipeline, now the pipeline, in my opinion, ought to be removed from the developer's ability to change necessarily, except through special processes. That's a whole different talk. But as we get into the reality here, the developer should be able to see the output of whatever code scan they're using. And that means that they need the dashboard that shows them, these are the vulnerabilities in the code that I'm having right now. And we need to be able to say that as we look at application security, and generally this is a security tool that a geek like me would use, right? A security geek. We need to make sure that that information gets back to the developer as well. Why? Well, they need to figure out where they need to put protections into the code. 9 times out of 10, this isn't something a security guy, person, geek, is going to fix. This is something that the developer is going to fix. So why is the security person sitting here looking at this specifically and not the developer? They should be able to see this too. In fact, it may be better for them to see this before the security person sees it at all. As we operate with knowledge and observability, we find out that monitoring is something everyone can see, right? If we do this the right way, everybody gets to see it. Everybody gets to understand that it's a functional requirement. That means it's an actual functional story. We've put it into our epic. There's a story that specifically calls out, there's a requirement that calls out the way that we're going to monitor these things. And suddenly these security monitors, these monitors in general, are able to push back and connect with the compliance engines that we've talked about. Now we go back to many of the things that we've talked about before, the top 10 list and all of that. Wouldn't it be cool if we could say in a template that we've pre-written for developers, hey, these things are taken care of. So we've done all of this work for you already, and here you go. Now, is that going to get done in security? Probably not. That's going to get done with security. Security is going to have a hand in helping. Security may have a hand in discussing. But we as security people need to make sure that we communicate gently and honestly about the things that are going on, and make sure that we weight things appropriately and don't push something because we think it might be a cool 0 day that may be down the pike at some point in the future. Let's take care of the problems we actually have. And right now, that's probably getting to the point where we write templates and understand how those templates get deployed. If the policies we write down are always monitored, we have to make sure that everything comes down to what that looks like. And that ends up looking stuff like this. If we look at the way that the resource catalog is going to play, we're going to go ahead and evaluate the pieces, parts that we have in all of our environments and say that, yeah, there's a problem with this one and it needs to be fixed. And if we have a service catalog around the different services that we're deploying, hey, these things are currently running the right way, or these things need help, or there's an issue with this one over here. Now, unfortunately, the screenshot, I couldn't figure out how to pop up the, hey, there's a problem with this particular little red line here in the middle, but take my advice. It's really neat when you get to be able to click on a specific thing on a screen as a developer, be able to see that, hey, there's a problem with this, and go right to the line of the logs that's showing it to you. Suddenly, that's really helpful, and it allows you to get to the point that you need to get to and correct it, as opposed to debate about it for months. The single source of truth here is exceptional. We're all able to communicate the same way if we can all look at the same logs and the same visualizations and get to the right point. And that's pretty much us. So with 10 minutes left, thank you for your time. Work on communication. Make observability functional. Single source of truth for everybody. And observability is for everyone, not just the people in DevSec or Ops, but everybody that needs it and wants it. It should be something that we all share. This is the time for questions. If you guys have questions, we'll go ahead and start looking at those.
Perfect. Nathan and Sam, let's go ahead and start diving into some questions. How does integrating security into every phase of DevOps affect application release time?
Well, that's an interesting question. So it depends on how you've quoted your sales team as far as how long it's going to take you. When we talk about this the first time, yeah, it's going to take longer, and you should assume that it's going to take longer. The goal here is, though, that as you do it a couple of times, you're able to reuse some of the templates that you have, and consequently, it should take less time. The reality is, though, absolutely, this will take more time to do it well. Doing something well is always a pull on the timeline that you're going to have. It's what it is.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that it does is just it's all built in early enough. Yes, it might take a little bit more of extra work up front, but over time it actually reduces what it would take. You don't have that reviews that you have to do at the very end or the last minute additions, or it's just built into the process. So over time it actually enhances it.
I think that's let's foot stomp on that, shall we, Sam? If you've worked at a Fortune 100, you've been through a gateway review, or you've been through a security gating committee review, and you've had to go back and redevelop things because somebody said nuh-uh. And when that happened, how long did that take you?
Yeah. And I could even expand that beyond security. Like, again, back to well-architected examples.
Yeah.
When I used to do it with customers, I used to tell them up front, before you start development, just look at the questions. Halfway through, we're going to go take a look at it and make sure we're in a good place. 3/4 as you're about to launch. And by doing it that way, what it enabled us to do is they're thinking about these things from the very beginning, so that any incremental work and rework is minimal down the line.
I think that's where Security Champions gets into it too. I would love to see, if I have my wish, in 5 years, everybody has a Security Champions program. And instead of even having to say halfway through and 3/4 through and all of that, literally there's a security person that is embedded in your team, and they're hanging out with your developers and your architects. And you know what? You found out 5 minutes after you wrote the code, as opposed to 2 months after you wrote the code, if that was 25% through. And this turns into an, oh, crap, really? I didn't know about that. Let me go fix that.
All right, so it looks like our next question is kind of in the realm of FinOps, but app performance is often the first indicator of security problems, which lead to higher bills. So what can you say to FinOps when implementing security into DevOps?
You want to take this one first? I'm going to see if I can find a link, Sam.
Okay. I mean, it seems to be more of a statement than a question, but I will say yes. We've seen examples of the bill might suddenly shoot up, or there might be a pattern of an increased amount of bandwidth used, or these anomalies or things that are unusual that come up. If my bill suddenly shoots up, it might be because, yes, I've deployed a new release, but maybe it's because somebody is constantly trying to make requests to my workload, and it's kind of some kind of a denial of service attack of some kind that's causing me to have more transaction costs, which is an interesting thing where you in theory have enough monitoring that you can detect those things before it really becomes more expensive. But it's one of those things that's unique to cloud in a way, because it does impact your bill, and you can look at it and say, why are we having an increase in cost? But yeah, I'd say, like, in my experience, I've seen that happen.
And I would agree. I think that app performance is definitely as an incident responder, the first thing I'm looking at is actually app performance. I want to know how the things are running and why not literally the first thing I do is unplug the network. But after that, it's understanding what the actual application performance is, all joking aside. It's being able to look at the actual metrics of the things going on. And if we don't have that, it makes it hard, especially if we haven't developed that. One thing I would say, if we want to get into FinOps and you have like a real interest in FinOps, a guy named Joe Daly that I've worked with in the past is actually the head of the FinOps org, or FinOps Foundation rather. And I'm sure that he would love to talk to you about all the FinOps questions you have. He really shines in this particular space.
Awesome. Thank you both. Our next question reads, traditionally, AppSec was a specialty created by taking a developer and teaching them application security, and organizations have been traditionally undersourced for AppSec specialists. Is DevSecOps driving us to all accept application security by design?
Interesting. I'm going to say yes.
I mean, go for it.
I would love to see honestly, I'm going to say something somewhat controversial. I would love in 10 years if security was a concept that we talk about and not a job description that we have to have. If Sam is a developer and I'm a developer, he says, hey, wait, is there a secure way to do that? And I go, oh yeah, hang out like this. And if that's the response and there's no security person to call, I think we've succeeded.
Well, what is the security person doing?
The security person is the developer doing the developing, and security becomes something that we culturally accept as a thing. It becomes a question of architecture. Have we architected this appropriately for a secure deployment? Have we written this in a secure way? Have we done these things in a good way? It becomes a question of quality.
And I'd say also the comment here about undersourced for AppSec specialists. Yes, I mean, that is true. But again, as we move toward more and more of these things built in, or more of these automations, or more of the policies and things that are written down as code, for example, instead of a governance or instead of a document, or less consultations needed, it can be one mechanism to help address some of those things.
Hey, Cody, there was a question about log storage. Do we want to touch on that real quick for the low cost?
Yeah. It looks like that'll be our last question for today. Go ahead and bring it up.
All right. So one of the things that came up was, could you suggest some low-cost, reliable log storage tools? I like SCP. As we talk about low cost and availability to do things like this, many of the things that go into how you do log storage cheaply or intensely, but not expensive, and how do we figure out, how do we make it resilient and okay, those are all great questions, and a lot of them go into object storage. I know how to do it in S3 really, really well, so that we're SCPing logs up to S3, and we're doing it in a low redundancy but multi-regionally distributed model, so that it doesn't cost you any more than the original S3 bucket would have cost you to begin with. And then we start looking at Glacier for rolling those things off into forevers, if you need to keep them for more than a month or two. You can look at something like a Datadog and put it in there as well, and that way you just let that deal with it, and then it deals with how those logs get stored and unified. Definitely more expensive than putting them in an S3 bucket and using SCP.
Well, all right. That looks like we are at the top of our hour. So, unfortunately, we are not going to be able to address everyone's questions today. We will make sure to send these over to Nathan and Sam. They can get back to you after the program concludes. But yeah, we are at the top of the hour. So, Sam and Nathan, thank you both so much for joining us today. It was really a pleasure getting to speak with you.
Thank
Thanks
you
a
very
lot.
much. Thank you, Cody. Thank you, everybody who joined us.
Bye, everybody.
So to our audience, I would just like to remind you that our session was recorded. Following this, you will receive an email with a link to access this recording on demand. You can also find it living on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars, and then just be sure to look in the on-demand section. It will be there waiting for you soon. The 4 winners of our $25 gift card drawing and the winner of our t-shirt. So these are for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. We have Nuan N, Alina V, Josh M, and Jennifer B. And the winner of our t-shirt is Karen M. So those 4 gift cards, you should be reached out to by us here at Techstrong here within the next 48 hours. So keep an eye out for an inbox to accept that gift card. And to Karen, our t-shirt winner, you will be reached out separately for that as well. Congratulations. To AWS and Datadog, our sponsors for today's program. We would really like to shout them out. We couldn't have had our program today without AWS and Datadog. And to everyone still with us, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate your time and we want to hear your feedback. So as soon as we close out, there will be a survey that pops up. Let us know what you thought about our program today, or if you have any feedback for an upcoming program, let us know what you'd like to see. Either way, we hope to see everyone at a future Techstrong learning experience. Have a great rest of your day. And Sam, Nathan, thank you both once again.
Thanks, Cody. It was lots of fun.